The first Shahed appeared on radar as a flicker over black water at 2:13 a.m. 30 seconds later there were 12, then 40. Then the radar picture began to clot into a moving wall of low-altitude returns pouring out of the northern Gulf like shrapnel carried by wind. And somewhere beneath the red glow of the USS George H.W. Bush's Combat Information Center, a countdown had already started, not to impact, to depletion. Because for the first time since the Red Sea drone campaigns against the Houthis, the U.S. Navy was staring at the exact scenario planners had feared for years. A mass drone assault designed not to sink a carrier strike group outright, but to bankrupt its defenses one missile at a time. Only this time, something on the Bush was different. Bolted to the flight deck in what looked like an oversized steel container, sat a system the Navy had kept almost completely quiet until April 2026. No dramatic Pentagon reveal. Just a delayed disclosure buried days before 3 U.S. carrier groups converged toward the Middle East as Iranian drone launches accelerated across the region. Inside that container was LOCUST, the laser weapon system the Navy had been testing aboard a nuclear-powered supercarrier. And if this hypothetical tactical scenario ever became real, the next few minutes would decide whether naval warfare had just fundamentally changed, because the geometry of the attack was brutal. Iranian Shahed drones do not need to be sophisticated to become dangerous. They only need numbers, persistence, and the ability to force expensive reactions. The Shahed 136 and newer Shahed 238 variants operate like flying artillery shells with guide systems attached. Slow, loud, cheap, but strategically poisonous. A single SM-2 interceptor can cost well over $2 million depending on configuration and support chain. Even the more compact SM interceptors still represent an expensive answer to something that may have cost tens of thousands to produce. That is the trap. The Houthis demonstrated it repeatedly in the Red Sea. Every engagement became an accounting problem. Every radar contact forced a decision. Every launch from a Mark 41 vertical launch system burned inventory that could not be replenished at sea. And that last part matters more than most people realize. Because the Mark 41 VLS is not a magazine in the normal sense. Once cells are emptied, reloading them in combat conditions is effectively impossible without specialized port support. Imagine a revolver where every chamber is welded shut after firing. That is the real pressure American destroyers operate under in sustained missile defense combat. Now multiply that problem across weeks. Then add Iran. This is where the tactical picture changes from manageable to dangerous. The Persian Gulf compresses reaction time. Distances are shorter. Heat distortion complicates optical tracking. Civilian shipping crowds radar returns. And drone launch points can hide inside layers of terrain, commercial infrastructure, or proxy territory. A Shahed flying low over warm water becomes a timing problem more than a visibility problem. At 120 knots, a drone swarm does not look terrifying on paper, but the danger is cumulative. Like termites inside structural steel, 1-10 may miss. But enough inbound objects force defenders to expose radar emissions, consume missiles, rotate crews, and reveal firing doctrine. That is what the attack is actually targeting. The system behind the fleet. And according to this hypothetical reconstruction, Iran's planners understand that perfectly. By 2:19 a.m., the first outer layer interceptors launched from accompanying Arleigh Burke class destroyers. The night over the Gulf erupts with vertical plumes as SM-series missiles claw into the sky. The intercept geometry is clean at first, long-range kills, predictable vectors, radar tracks collapsing one after another. But the problem isn't the first wave, it's the second. Because the moment U.S. ships commit interceptors, the math begins running backward. Every missile fired reduces future options. Every VLS cell emptied creates dead space inside the fleet. And somewhere inside Iran's operational planning cycle, someone is likely counting those launches in real time. This is why the LOCUST system matters, not because lasers are science fiction, because they attack the cost equation itself. The AeroVironment LOCUST laser weapon system aboard the Bush was never designed to replace missiles entirely. It was designed to absorb the lowest and most numerous layer of threats before they forced expensive defensive responses. Think of it like moving from firing shotgun shells at mosquitoes to turning on a floodlight that burns them continuously as long as power exists. And aboard a Nimitz-class supercarrier powered by 2 A4W nuclear reactors, power is the one resource that effectively does not run out. That changes everything. A traditional missile defense ship fights from a finite magazine. A laser-equipped nuclear carrier fights from a power grid. That distinction sounds technical until the first saturation wave arrives. At 2:23 a.m., radar operators aboard the strike group identify fragmentation in the inbound picture. The original swarm has split altitude bands. Some drones just stay low over the water. Others climb slightly to complicate fire control prioritization. A handful deliberately lag behind to exploit radar confusion after intercept detonations. This is not random. It is pressure engineering, the naval equivalent of forcing a goalkeeper to defend 5 angles simultaneously. And then the bush activates the laser. No missile plume, no thunder, no cinematic streak across the sky. Just a nearly invisible beam stabilizing onto a drone skin panel for several seconds. That's the part most people misunderstand about laser weapons. They do not explode targets like movie weapons. They kill through structural and thermal failure. Sensors blind first. Flight surfaces weaken. Internal electronics overheat. Fuel compartments ignite. A drone simply loses coherence in the air. Sometimes it spirals. Sometimes it burns. Sometimes it just falls apart. At operational ranges, the process can look strangely anticlimactic. But tactically, it is devastating, because the cost-exchange ratio collapses overnight. A missile costing millions suddenly gives way to an engagement measured in electricity consumption. And the deeper implication is even more dangerous. The carrier group no longer has to choose between conserving interceptors and protecting itself. For the first time, it can start filtering targets economically. Outer layer for ballistic or high-speed threats. Laser layer for drones. Missiles reserved for what truly matters. That sounds obvious now, but this is where most people got the story wrong. The laser itself is not the revolution. The revolution is what it frees the fleet to stop wasting. For 2 decades, the U.S. Navy has quietly wrestled with a terrifying logistical truth. Missile defense combat is easier to start than sustain. The Red Sea proved it. Iranian doctrine understands it. China has studied it obsessively. You can build the world's most advanced destroyer, but if 1,000 low-cost drones force it to expend finite interceptors, the attacker begins controlling operational tempo through economics instead of firepower. That is the nightmare scenario LOCUST was designed to interrupt, and as the third wave approaches in this hypothetical engagement, the tactical picture becomes uglier than expected. Because now the drones change behavior. Some begin weaving, others descend below radar clutter thresholds. A handful appear configured as decoys, deliberately exaggerating infrared signatures to draw attention from genuine strike platforms moving behind them. This is important because modern naval combat is increasingly becoming a sensor war before it becomes a missile war. Detection quality determines survival, and Iran's doctrine increasingly focuses on overwhelming classification systems rather than brute force penetration. Imagine trying to identify individual sparks inside a forest fire while every spark moves independently. That is what combat information centers face during swarm conditions. At 2:31 a.m., an Arleigh Burke destroyer deploys ODIN, the optical dazzling interdictor. Unlike LOCUST, ODIN is not primarily designed to burn targets from the sky. Its purpose is sensor disruption, confusion, blindness, and against its systems like the Shahed 238. That matters. 238 introduces a different problem entirely: jet-powered, faster, lower reaction windows, potentially more resistant to older engagement assumptions. The drone behaves less like a lawnmower engine with wings and more like a primitive cruise missile, which means timing collapses dramatically. A ship that previously had minutes may now have seconds. ODIN attacks the guidance architecture itself: optical seekers, sensor stabilization, terminal tracking logic. Imagine shining a precision floodlight directly into the eye of an incoming weapon while it attempts to thread a needle at high speed. The drone does not need to explode to fail. It only needs to stop understanding where it is. And according to this hypothetical scenario, one Shahed 238 suddenly veers wide off bearing, descending toward open water after its sensor package loses coherence under ODIN exposure. Cost of engagement, potentially dollars in electrical expenditure. Cost of the drone destroyed, magnitudes higher. And now the strategic implications begin rippling outward. Because if directed energy systems reliably neutralize mass drone attacks cheaply, then entire assumptions about naval saturation warfare begin to crack. Not disappear, crack. That distinction matters. Lasers still face atmospheric attenuation, dust, humidity, thermal blooming, weather degradation, beam stabilization limits, cooling requirements, engagement duration problems. A missile moving at max speeds compresses dwell time brutally, but drones are different. Slow enough, fragile enough, predictable enough, and critically numerous enough to justify the investment. At 2:38 a.m., the strike group faces the real test. A mixed attack package emerges from the clutter. This is the scenario carrier commanders fear most because it forces prioritization under uncertainty. The drones were never intended to kill the carrier alone. They were shaping the battlefield. Behind them now comes the possibility of anti-ship missiles exploiting defensive saturation. This is where naval combat becomes geometry under stress. Every ship in the strike group has overlapping engagement sectors, radar cones, electronic warfare arcs, interceptor envelopes, but those systems are not infinite circles on a screen. They are constrained by orientation, terrain masking, radar horizon, and line-of-sight physics. A carrier group resembles a moving three-dimensional puzzle constantly trying to keep its strongest defensive faces pointed toward threat axes, now compress decision-making into seconds. One commander must determine whether a low-flying radar return is another expendable drone or the front edge of a missile strike package. Another decides whether to preserve interceptors for possible supersonic threats or expend them now. Another watches VLS inventory counts silently falling. And above all of them hangs the same invisible clock, not timing to impact, time to exhaustion. This is why the introduction of laser systems changes operational psychology as much as battlefield capability. The fleet suddenly breathes differently, because every drone destroyed electrically preserves missiles for the threat that truly cannot be handled any other way. At 2:42 a.m., LOCUST begins engaging targets continuously, and the operational effect becomes cumulative. Drones that survive initial intercept layers arrive fragmented instead of concentrated. Formation coherence breaks down. Some lose sensors. Others suffer control surface damage. The swarm stops behaving like a coordinated pressure wave and starts behaving like debris scattered by turbulence. That matters because saturation depends on synchronization. A staggered attack is easier to digest. A compressed attack overwhelms. LOCUST is not merely killing drones, it is destroying timing. And timing is everything in naval warfare. A Tomahawk launch, a carrier recovery cycle, a radar sweep, a defensive intercept window, all are ultimately choreography measured in seconds. Break timing and systems begin working against each other. Then comes the hidden vulnerability nobody discusses publicly enough: heat. Directed energy warfare generates enormous thermal management problems. The laser may have effectively limitless electrical supply aboard a nuclear carrier, but waste heat still has to go somewhere. This is the engineering knife fight underneath the battlefield spectacle. You are essentially concentrating massive energy loads into precision beams while trying not to cook your own equipment in Gulf temperatures. Think of holding a blowtorch steady for extended periods while trapped inside a steel box under desert heat conditions. Cooling architecture becomes survival architecture. And in prolonged engagements, thermal cycling may become just as important as ammunition capacity. This is where the future battlefield starts looking less like traditional naval warfare and more like industrial-scale energy management under fire. At 2:49 a.m., the final wave arrives, and it is larger than expected, not because Iran necessarily intended decisive destruction tonight, but because strategic reconnaissance is occurring simultaneously with combat. Every engagement reveals information: radar frequencies, response timing, target prioritization doctrine, laser dwell characteristics, interceptor sequencing. The strike group is fighting drones. Iran is studying the fleet. That changes the meaning of the battle entirely, because now the objective is not simply penetration. It is learning which drones survived longest, which bearings forced missile launches, how quickly did ODIN activate, what weather conditions degraded beam performance, what altitude bands proved hardest to defend. Modern warfare increasingly resembles hostile systems analysis conducted in real time. And suddenly the Bush's laser container stops looking experimental. It starts looking inevitable. By 2:57 a.m., debris fields scatter across the Gulf. Burning fragments strike water. Interceptor inventory is reduced but preserved far beyond what older engagement doctrine would have allowed. The strike group remains operational. But the deeper outcome is strategic, because everyone watching this hypothetical engagement learns the same lessons simultaneously. Cheap drones alone may no longer guarantee favorable cost exchange against advanced naval powers, and that threatens one of the central assumptions behind modern asymmetric warfare. For years, the logic seemed unstoppable. Build inexpensive attack drones, launch them en masse, force expensive defensive reactions, drain superior militaries financially and logistically. But LOCUST and ODIN hint at a future where energy, not missiles, absorbs the swarm, where nuclear-powered carriers effectively carry bottomless defensive magazines against low-end aerial threats, where electrical generation capacity becomes combat endurance, and where the side with the larger power grid may outlast the side with the larger drone factory. That does not make carriers invulnerable. Far from it. Hypersonics still compress reaction windows brutally. Ballistic anti-ship weapons remain existential threats. Submarines still operate in silence beneath all this technology. Cyber warfare still targets sensor fusion and command chains, but the drone equation is changing. And that matters because drones were supposed to be the democratization weapon of the modern battlefield. Cheap enough for proxies, numerous enough for attrition, disposable enough to alter strategy. Now, the United States Navy appears to be building systems specifically designed to reverse that advantage, and the implications stretch far beyond Iran, the Red Sea, the South China Sea, Taiwan contingency planning, carrier survivability doctrine, future destroyer architecture. Everything starts bending around one question: can energy weapons reliably absorb the first wave cheaply enough to preserve the fleet for the real war behind it? Because that is what this scenario was actually about from the beginning. Not lasers, not drones, endurance, the ability to stay in the fight longer than the enemy's assumptions allow. That is the true strategic weapon aboard the USS George H.W. Bush. Not infinite power, infinite patience. A fleet that no longer bleeds missiles against every low-cost aerial target becomes dramatically harder to exhaust, dramatically harder to corner, dramatically harder to manipulate economically. And once that shift happens, entire doctrines built around swarm attrition begin losing leverage. That is why this quiet disclosure in April 2026 mattered so much. Not because the Navy revealed a container on a flight deck, because it revealed where naval warfare is going next. Toward energy, toward persistence, toward battles decided not by who fires first, but by who runs out last. And if this hypothetical scenario reflects even part of the future, then the era of using cheap drones to economically suffocate carrier groups may already be entering its final phase. The next naval arms race may not be about missiles alone. It may be about megawatts. If you want more tactical breakdowns like this, subscribe now.